To demonstrate the binding tips, I'm going to use this table topper. Here's a quick look at the front and back of the table topper. So normally we're going to measure the outside dimensions of the quilt in total. And since this is a little over 24 by 24 square, then I know I can just multiply 24 by 4. So that would give us 96, right? So once we have our overall length we need, we'll want to add some length to that, because when we start our binding, say at the bottom and the middle, we work our way around, we want to do a mitered seam at the end, and we need some extra fabric to facilitate doing that, and we definitely don't want to run short, right? So we're going to want it to be at least 10 to 12 inches longer than our overall length. Going around the outside edges of our quilt or our table topper. And so since I have the dimensions of 96 inches, I can just add to that, say I would want, around 106, 108 inches, something like that. Well, since I know this is almost 42 inches, if I multiply that times 3, I have 126 inches, right? I know that it's more than enough for the binding I need for this table topper. One of the other things we'll want to do is to make this a little easier on ourselves. You can see this was folded. It's got these creases like this all over it, almost like a grid pattern. And so I'm going to do a little ironing of this fabric first before I cut the strips out of it to try to get some of those wrinkles out of the way. I may not get them entirely out, but I'll make them a lot better by doing that. In some cases, depending on how badly this is wrinkled, if it's been folded for quite a while, we might even have to spritz it with some water. Some people like to starch everything, but I'm going to see if I can get this in a little better condition. Then I'll cut my 2.5 inch strips from this fabric. Now that I'm cutting my strips, I'm going to even up one edge of the fabric. And again, we're cutting 2.5 inch strips. Another tip about binding is we have these strips, right? We could easily mishandle them while we're doing some of these steps after we have these strips cut, and then we could stretch them or distort them. So it's definitely something we want to be careful about, is not stretching or distorting these strips as we're working with them. Before we join these together to make our binding, we're just going to cut off the selvage and get us a nice square end to work with. We'll do that for each one. Another tip for our bindings is not to join them together in the normal way. So normally, if we're joining fabric together, we would just put them right sides together, right, and line up the edges, and then we would run a seam right down, a 1/4 inch seam from the edge here. But we'd like to have a nice mitered binding, right, where the seam on the binding between the strips is on a 45-degree to give a little more pleasing appearance. What we can do then is just join our pieces together like this. They're still right sides together, but we laid them across each other like this. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew a line diagonally, and that way we can cut off the outside corner a 1/4 inch beyond the seam, and then we'll have a nice 45-degree angled seam where the two strips come together. You may find it helpful to pin the pieces together. One of the reasons is we have a little bit of a blind spot right here. We can't really see where that's at, right? So if we pin this fabric, we know that we lined up the diagonal corners of the two pieces of fabric, and hopefully it's not going to move around too much if we pin it. So you can see that back here, that's still lined up with the edge, and up here it's also lined up with the edge. Now the other thing you could do, if you so choose, is you could mark a diagonal line on this. And so what I'm trying to do here now is line up that diagonal corner in my pencil mark. I'm just going to draw a line from corner to corner. You may prefer to use like that white chalk marker. So now we have our two pieces of fabric, our right sides together, our diagonal line, and our pinning. We can just line that line up with the very center of our presser foot where our needle's at. We can start our seam. And then now what we want to do is we want to keep this back side lined up with the center of our seam tape. So here you can see my seam. I can remove my pins now. It might be good just to double check ourselves. Did we come out on the point of the corner? Yes. And again, yes. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to cut off this excess fabric, leaving that 1/4 inch seam allowance there. So we'll just line our ruler up with our seam. There's a 1/4 inch mark here from the edge. And so now we have our nice 45-degree seam. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to press that open, right? So we turn it over the other side. You can see that we have our nice 45-degree angle seam. So I have 3 pieces of fabric, right? So I have another one of these joints to do. I'm going to sew the other 2 pieces together, and then I'll do the cutting and the pressing, and then we'll move on from there to the next step. Since we're using width of fabric strips in many cases, we're likely to have a wrinkle at the top fold of the fabric, right? It's a fairly prominent wrinkle usually. So you can choose however you want to deal with this. You can spritz it with some water. You can use some starch on it, but it probably will go a little better if we get that prominent wrinkle out of there. So even though we pressed our seams that we used to join our strips together, we also want to look at the rest of the binding fabric before we do any further folding and pressing, just to look to see what other kind of major wrinkles we might have. If we don't get those major wrinkles out, and then we're trying to press the binding in half, then that can cause us some challenges. Or even if we press it in half and then we're starting to work our way around the quilt and we have one of those large wrinkles in it, it could make our binding process not go very smoothly when we're joining it to the quilt. So we want to press our binding to make it half the width it is, right? And so this is another area where we have to be careful that we don't mishandle it. It'd be a little easy because you're fighting with trying to get the fabric folded as you press it in half. And you could pull on or tug on it and stretch it out and distort it. Even with the iron, I suppose, you could manhandle it too much. So once we have it started where it's folded in half with wrong sides together, we're just going to continue down the line. And so usually everybody probably has their own way they do this. And I think there's even a machine that can do this. If a person wants to buy one. So you don't have to do it manually, but I've still been doing these manually myself. Some people prefer doing this type of stuff manually. So you can see how we're just folding the width in half. So I have to work my way all the way down this binding. It's, a little over, it's around 120 inches or so. And I'll just continue on and get this done. And here we can see the end result of our 45-degree seam where the 2 strips are joined together. And here you can see I have the binding all pressed. Again, we're pressing wrong sides together to reduce the binding to half its width. Sometimes people, if they're not going to be able to attach the binding to their quilt right away, they'll take this binding and wrap it around. You could buy something for that purpose. You could have a simple piece of cardboard and just wrap it around something to keep it from getting messed up until you can use the binding. So that's another option. If you're going to store the binding for a while and not join it to the quilt right away, then you might want to do some organization of it instead of just leaving this pile of binding fabric laying around somewhere. Another helpful tip, I think, is to remove your cutting mat. If you have a cutting mat on your sewing table, I would suggest removing it. And the reason is it's going to move around underneath your quilt as you're trying to join the binding to the quilt. Sometimes it's a large quilt, right? And it's all bulky on top of your sewing table. But if you have that cutting mat under there, it's going to slide around and you're going to be fighting two things instead of just the quilt to try to keep it, not going off the edge of the table and also organized so that it'll go through the sewing machine properly. Another tip is to double check the color of thread you have loaded in your machine. The last thing you want to do is overlook this, and then you're having to get out your seam ripper. We can get started joining our binding to the back of our quilt. We're leaving some extra here. We're starting at the bottom about halfway across. We're going to leave a space in the middle because we're going to come back around the other end and we want to do our miter joint right here. So we're leaving this excess here to work with to do that joint at the end. When we join our binding to the back of the quilt, we want to make sure we join the raw edges to the quilt, and that way when this binding is folded around to the front of the quilt, we'll have the folded edge as a finished edge on the front of the quilt. As we approach the corner of the quilt, we want to slow down a little bit. Take a note of where the very point of the corner of the quilt is. I might have to raise the binding to double check that. And slow down so that we can, once we get like about a 1/4 inch from the corner, we want to veer directly towards the corner point. And we'll sew off the edge of that and we can cut the thread there. Here you can see a close-up of the front. Here you can see a close-up of the back. My seam veers off at a slight curve. You may prefer to veer off at a very sharp, a direct line to the corner once you reach a 1/4 inch from the edge. Once we've sewn our seam over to the point of the corner, then what we're going to do is we want to continue joining the binding, the correct edge to the edge of the quilt, right? Which is this edge where the fabric that's been folded opens up still. So we're going to take the fabric, you can kind of hold it like this, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to make, it's kind of like a fold here, and so that the square edge of the folded binding is kind of even with the outside of the corner there. So it takes a little bit of sometimes fussiness. We have it folded, and we can see also that it goes to the folds square to the outside edge here this way. We don't want this to be real bunched up or the fold to be kind of uneven or buckled, because that's going to affect how this unfolds when we wrap this around the front of the quilt and we're joining the binding to the front. So this being neat affects us later on. And so once we have that ready, we can take that up to the presser foot, make sure we don't lose our grip on it so that we don't misposition it. And then we'll also start sewing at the outside edge. And of course, back stitch. And just get this corner started here so that we can then go on down that side of the quilt. And so once I get to the other corner, I'll take a picture of that up close and show you what that looks like. And so you can see this fold that was done and how the folded binding is kind of lined up with the outside edge of the corner there. And there's the other side. And so I'm going to work my way around to the place where we started, since I've already shown you how to join the fabric to the edge of the quilt and then do the corner. I'm going to work my way around to here and I'll show you this miter joint that we're going to create when we get back to the other end. So you can see that I've made my way back around the quilt with the binding on the back. And I stopped here and left this gap. Why did I leave that gap? Well, when we go to join the two pieces together with a miter joint, we're going to want to be able to take the quilt and fold a little like this so that we have room to put these two pieces together and pin them possibly and run them through the sewing machine. If we sew this down too close together, we don't have a gap that allows us to have that luxury of squeezing quilt itself together to give us some room to play with these two pieces of binding. And so that's why we leave a gap. You can leave a bigger one if you like, there's no problem. But if you make it too small, it's going to be challenging. So next what we want to do is, you can see how our binding is going to reach each other, right? I had extra, but we need to know how much to overlap the two pieces of binding to do our 45-degree miter joint. What I'm going to do is, off the longer piece, I'm going to cut off a piece of binding. It can be a short piece, doesn't have to be long. And I'm going to unfold that. Or this is an approximate amount that I need the one piece of binding to overlap the other. So what I'm going to do is, about halfway across here, I'm going to cut the one off. So you get an idea. So about half would be here. I'm going to lay this piece across there just to remind me where I want to cut it. And so I'm going to cut this one off. And so now we can take the piece of fabric that we have, and we want our other piece to overlap by about this much, but we want to make sure we don't have a wrinkle here or anything like that. You know, it's laying down nice and flat. And then we're going to bring our other piece of fabric over. I personally feel like this measurement is approximate. The reason I say that is because if you do this other piece exactly to the edge of the width of that piece of binding, I have personally found that sometimes it seems like your binding is slightly too long after you join these two pieces together, and then you have this excess fabric in the binding you're trying to sew down through here, and you've got where it's going to want to fold. You're going to get a fold because you've got your binding can be too long. I personally like to cut this back about between a 16th and an 1/8, maybe at least a 16th, and so just make sure that the other end is still to the edge. I'll turn this way so we can see that better. So just making sure this piece is to the edge of it, and it is. And then I'm going to overlap this piece of binding on top of that, and I'm using this as a guide to know where to cut it. But as I said, I'm not going to cut exactly to this edge. I'm going to cut a 16th inch or a little bit more shorter, because I don't want to be fighting with excess binding, and then I have so much binding that I can't get the binding to join properly to the back of the quilt after I join these two pieces together. So cutting a little bit shorter just makes us slightly tighter without having any excess fabric in our binding. Now the question is, how do we make this joint? Well, in my opinion, one of the things that helps is to make a couple labels. You know, sometimes you're starting to do this and you're scratching your head and you're saying, how do I do that? What's the right way to do this? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a label the width of this. And you might be thinking, why in the world is Mark cutting labels for this? It'll be more evident here in a moment. What we're going to do is we're going to lay this down. I'm not twisting it, right? You see how I have unfolded it. I'm just opening it and turning it like this a little bit. You can see how it continues. And then if I take one of my scraps of fabric here, this is just to guide me on where to place the label, because this tells me again how wide of a piece of binding is going to be laying on top of this when I join it. And I lay that scrap there to the edge. Now I know how much my other piece is going to overlap that. But I can take one of my labels and I can put it over here like that, right? There's my A and my B. So now I need to take the other one and put a label on it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to unfold it as well. I'm not twisting it. You can see here's how it's laid. I'm not going to twist it a lot. But what I am going to do is I'm going to put my label on this one also. So what I'm trying to do here is I want to lay this label on the left-hand side with my A and my B, right? So looking at the binding on this side again, notice that I'm not twisting it a lot. All I'm doing is unfolding it and putting that label right there. On this one, all I did was I took the binding on the top side and I unfolded it and laid it flat over on the surface. And I put my label, the width of the binding, unfolded to the left-hand side of that. Okay, so now that I have the two labels on, all I'm doing is I'm kind of folding up the fabric to allow us to lay this properly, to pin this. So again, notice here's the way the binding's laying on the quilt. All I'm going to do is unfold that. And now what I'm doing is I need to line up the outside corner of the fabric, right, of the binding fabric. This pinning is this is always a little bit of a struggle because you're kind of fighting against the quilt wanting to pull away. You have it folded and it's wanting to pull away from you because you folded that quilt up just to try to get these two pieces of fabric to lay together so you could pin them. And since we're going to be doing a 45-degree seam corner to corner, we want to think about where we place our pins so that we're not placing our pin where we have to sew or where the presser foot has to go. So here again on this other side, I'm going to pin it, just checking my edges of my fabric to make sure the corners still lined up. So I'll pin this other side. Paper doesn't make pinning any easier. Okay. Here's a close-up view of those labels and pinning. And then here's where our seam will go. So now you can see I have the labels are together, A and B. I've put them face to face. I have two pins on a 45 here so that I can sew from this corner down to this back corner. And then once I'm done, I will have a 45-degree seam. I can do a 1/4 inch seam allowance and cut off the corner to the outside and then press that, and I'll have a nice miter joint for my binding. And of course, when you do this seam on the sewing machine, because we pinned this, right, but we're still twisted up a little because we're trying to fold this quilt up to give us the room we need to have these two fabrics lay face to face and lay flat. So we kind of have to check our edges again as we join this. I'm actually at this point though going to pull the label back on the corner because I really don't want to sew through that label. I suppose you could if you wanted to leave it there, but in my preference would be not to sew through that label. So I'm just going to start a seam and then check my back corner, make sure the edge is still lined up with the back corner, see where it's at, and then line that up with my seam tape, the center line of my seam tape. And then I'm going to join these together. Just double checking where I'm at as I get closer. Okay, I just wanted to show you the result. Little curve when I was over here, and I had the quilt was twisted a little when I first started in the sewing machine. So it straightened up, it got a slight curve in it. But you can see on the back side that our seam runs corner to corner. So we can remove our pins and remove our labels. And we can cut off our excess fabric, but I'm going to be a little lazy on having to put a cutting mat up here on the table since I'm still joining binding to the quilt. What we have is our miter joint, but we could press that, right? We have our seam here that we didn't press. And again with this, the challenge is getting the fabric of the binding to lay flat to press this seam open. Obviously not impossible, just kind of like trying to get a 2-year-old who's in one of those states where they don't want to do what you want them to do, or they're exhausted, or they're tired and sleepy, or something like that. And so then we can fold it back and repress where we've joined our two pieces of binding together. Ooh, that's hot. And so now we have our miter joint and we're ready to join that to the back of the quilt. We just finish our seam down this side and we'll have the back completed. You can see the miter joint barely starts here and goes over here. Bring it back into view of the camera here a little better. So you can see the miter joint starts here and ends over here. The side will be seen on the front. Kind of hard to see even on this fabric. It blends in very nicely. We have where we ended. We stopped sewing here. We started sewing on this side. We'll just finish our seam across the edge of the quilt, joining the binding to the quilt on the back. So now that I've crossed over where I had started sewing before, I'll go just a little farther and then backstitch. So here is on the back side, you can see the miter joint starts and ends here. Once we fold this over to the front of the quilt, you can see that here. So it'll be a really nice, clean looking seam on the front side. So it's time to turn the quilt over and join the binding to the front of the quilt. This might come down to your preference, but you notice my stitch length is 2.4. I'm going to bump that up to 3. This just gives a little nicer appearance on the front of the quilt. Again, you may have your own preference, but that's what I'm going to do before I start joining the binding to the front of the quilt. I'm going to start on the front where I actually kind of did that joint or that seam on the back. And so you'll see how we can just fold our binding over to get started and start joining the binding to the front of the quilt. We always have where the backing, quilt top, and batting all come together. We'll have some ravelings. If we can just fold those in under as we go, we won't have to worry about cutting them off. They'll be sewn inside of the binding. If someone had the preference, I guess, they could go and try to trim those off. The thing is they just keep coming and coming. If you think I'm going to trim all those off, it's like an elusive thing because they just keep coming. Now, one of the things we probably want to do, this all may come down to your preference of how you like your binding to look, but I'm going to try to go for that it's a 1/2 inch. It appears to be a 1/2 inch wide from the front. I'll have to admit, I kind of can guess a 1/2 inch, but I'm not really sure that I'm seasoned enough to watch and keep it a 1/2 inch consistently. So I'm going to get something that's a 1/2 inch wide so I can check it as I go, because I kind of like to try to keep it consistent if I can. I have a tendency to pull too, this is just everyone's different. I tend to pull too much and make it too wide on the front. That tends to be my tendency. I don't really know why. So I'm going to try to find something here that's like a 1/2 inch wide so that I can kind of like gauge as I go along. Just check it every so often and make sure I'm staying close to a 1/2 inch on the front. So I have this 2.5 inch ruler. It has a 1/2 inch mark on it. So I'm just going to use that. So again, what I said is I'm just checking to see if I'm generally close to 1/2 inch where I'm going to get started. On this sewing machine, but I found that when doing bindings, if I keep the left edge of the fabric in the center of this left side of the presser foot, kind of to the center, that is actually where the thread comes out, just on the other side of the edge of that binding. So that's kind of what I shoot for. And again, that's not a perfect thing because you tend to have some variation in movement as you go. Now, when we start getting close to the corner, this is a good time to slow down because the corner is where we want to try to make a nice, clean fold in our corner, right? And so if we get excited and we're going real fast, it's kind of hard to do that very neat. You can see if we lay this flat down, it already starts to create this 45-degree angle out here, right? Because of the way our binding's folded and wrapped around from the back. And then what we want to do is fold the bottom up. And I'd have to say, I think this must take a few years to get the mastery of this joint here on the corner. I wouldn't say it's easy, but we're looking for as clean of a fold, smooth, that we can get. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll sew right up over the edge of that. Now that we're to that point, we have to raise the presser foot. This is so that we can pivot the quilt and make the turn. We didn't cut our thread, right? And so now that we've made our turn around the corner and created our hopefully nice folded 45-degree fold there where we made our corner, we'll just continue joining the binding to the table topper. So I will work my way around back to where I started and we'll finish up there. So here you can see that I've made my way back around to where I started, joining the binding to the front of the quilt. And so now I just have this one short section to finish up. So I just wanted to show you the miter joint. And you can see that here. Followed around to the back, right there. So that miter joint makes for a really nice looking finish. I wouldn't say I'm the world's best at these corners, but again, where we do our corners, we're hoping to get a nice, clean 45-degree fold. I hope you found some of these tips for quilt binding helpful. And if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. Please share your comments. You may have your own tips and tricks. If you haven't subscribed to my channel already, I encourage you to do so. And until we meet again, I'm wishing you happy sewing and beautiful finishes.